Okay. Okay. And the little red button's going. So. All right. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Today, January 15th, 2014. The interview location is on Ridge Trail, Buxton, North Carolina. My name is Sandy Jones Garrison, and I'm interviewing Susan West, journalist, currently residing in Buxton, North Carolina. Susan, can you just please state your full name and your place of birth?
Yes. Susan West, W-E-S-T, and I was born in Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay. So what year did you arrive? Was it Hatteras Island?
It was Hatteras Island. I've lived in almost every village on Hatteras Island. It was 1974 when I first came here to stay. And I had a job in Salvo working for a small realty company. Back then, there were probably, I don't know, maybe 15 cottages in Salvo, and I helped manage those and help with renting those out to visitors. I knew about Hatteras Island because my family had vacationed here. 1968, I think, was the first time we came here.
They vacationed in Salvo or?
In Avon. They stayed in a cottage in Avon.
Okay.
And same thing, I don't remember how many cottages were there, but, you know, it was a whole lot of vacant beach property around. And we had always vacationed in Ocean City, Maryland, and my mother said, you know, she was looking at a magazine and saw a little tiny ad for, you know, rentals on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And when she inquired, they were a whole lot cheaper than the places in Ocean City. So that's how we ended up coming here.
So the bridge was
yes,
built
yeah,
when you came over. Well, so you started vacationing in the late 60s, but what brought you here to live?
Well, that's sort of an interesting question, Sandy. I had graduated from college in Maryland, Towson State, with a degree in history. My last year at college, I had a part-time job at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore City, and I worked in their manuscripts division. And it was basically a great job for me because what I did, people would donate boxes of old papers, and I dug through everything and cataloged everything. And I've always loved old papers and old things. It was a little bit conservative atmosphere. You know, it was like, you know, I didn't have a whole lot in common with a lot of the folks that I worked with. But it was a great job. It paid nothing. Absolutely nothing. Pennies. But okay, money's never been a big concern, driving force. There was a woman named Hester who worked in the library, and I guess I thought she was a gazillion years old. And she was very well preserved. I mean, she didn't have a wrinkle on her face, a small line, or anything. And I was driving home after work one day, and I was on a crowded expressway in my old beat-up Ford Falcon. And all of a sudden, I just thought, you know what? If I don't make a change right now, I'm going to be here forever. And I'll probably end up like Hester, you know, working at the Historical Society forever and ever. I need to go live someplace else. So I thought, okay, well, I've been to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina a couple of times. I liked it. Yeah, maybe I'll move there. So I resigned from my job, went on a kind of detour to outside of Tucson, Arizona on an archaeological dig for about a month. Then got back to Maryland, packed my belongings into my little Ford Falcon, and came down here and had that job in Salvo. The first couple of years I was here, the first couple of years that I lived here, I didn't stay here year round. I wasn't, I didn't have a job during the winter time, so I would go back to Maryland. One winter I stayed in Greenville. So I think it was 1977 when was the year that I was brave enough of going, okay, I'm going to stay here through the winter and see what a winter on Hatteras Island is like.
And that's when you took up with the real estate company, or you had been working with the real estate company?
That first summer that I was here, I worked for the real estate company. Then I've had a lot of jobs. I've waitressed. I waitressed for a long time on the island.
What restaurants did you waitress?
I waitressed at the Seashell restaurant in Hatteras Village. That building was washed away during Hurricane Isabel. That's where I met my future husband, Rob. I was a waitress and he was cook. And, you know, I used to go hang my order in the kitchen and, bat my eyelashes and flirt with him. Then I also waitressed at the Pollitt House restaurant here in Buxton for a long time. And after my waitressing career, which the last year I did that, I realized I needed to make a change. I went to work for the Postal Service. So part-time clerk. I started that in 1990, and I was able to retire after 15 years. So that was 2005. I retired. Primarily, I worked in Avon, the Avon Post Office.
Okay. Well, you mentioned meeting Rob down in Hatteras. So was it love at first sight, or were you friends at first?
It was, there was an attraction right away. Okay. So that was in the summertime when he started working there. I think he was hired as a dishwasher and then quickly promoted to cook because help was always an issue at a lot of the places on the island back then. And I guess it was that fall I gave up the little house that I rented in Avon and moved into the trailer where he was living in Hatteras, in a section of Hatteras called Sticky Bottom.
Do you have a story on how that's named Sticky Bottom?
I think just because it's particularly low there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that, there was a little area back there with probably 4 or 5 mobile homes, and he rented one, and I moved in there, and it was great. It was really nice to be able to walk around the village of Hatteras and all. One of my funny memories was walking back to the trailer one afternoon, and there was an elderly woman out there in her driveway with a shovel with a turtle.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, "Do you want this?" I was like, "I don't think so." She goes, "It makes a real good dish, you know." And I'm just looking at this turtle thinking, how would I ever get into it to get to the meat, you know? I was like, I don't think so. But, you know, it was a Hatteras village, but I enjoyed living there because it was so walkable.
Mm-hmm.
You could get to stores and the post office and everything. So we lived there. Let's see.
Well, Rob is I'm sure he's not a cook any longer. So, at what point did he change careers, and what did he do? Because it usually impacts the wife or the significant other what they end up doing. Yeah,
he Rob's is originally from Long Island, New York, and he used to come down here from the time he was about 16 with surfer buddies. They used to stay like in Frisco Campground, Ward Barnett's place. In fact, I think Rob's told me that he and his friends were some of the first customers that Ward had when he opened up that campground. And they'd pick up jobs, summertime jobs, just to get by, so just support surfing during the day. They'd work in a restaurant at night. So he was still in college when I met him, and this was, you know, he was here for the summer, and he was going back to Long Island to go back to college. And then at the end of that summer, a fella approached him and said, "Oh, Rob, why don't you take, you know, a semester off from college? I need a mate on my fishing boat." And Rob said, "Yeah, I think that sounds great. I've always wanted to be a commercial fisherman." Now, I'm not really sure where that came from, because Rob's family history, there were no commercial fishermen. His dad was a policeman, you know, and his mom was a housewife. And before that, his Polish grandfather worked in a wicker factory, you know. So there was no history of commercial fishing. But Rob decided to stay and to fish. And that was end of story. I mean, it attracted him, and, you know, being on the water as a surfer or as a fisherman, you know, that's what he likes. So his cooking career was just really a means to an end. It wasn't something that he ever planned to do.
So, when did you become involved when he became into the business of being a commercial fisherman? When did you realize that there needed to be a voice for that profession?
In 1992, I can tell you exactly how that happened. Rob, at that time, was fishing with Ted James, who has since passed away, has Fox Water Sport, and had the boat called the Water Sport. And they were fishing, and I believe, I'm not sure, but I think it was a issue about shark fishing. They went to Morehead City to a fisheries meeting, and Rob came back and said, you know, there were some women who spoke at that meeting. They were starting a women's auxiliary, and I thought, you probably need something like that around here, because at that time we really didn't have any kind of communication system. We didn't have, this is before internet, access to news, issues that were coming up. So I remember I sat in my living room one afternoon and wrote down a list of all the wives and mothers and sisters of commercial fishermen I could think of, and just started calling and say, do you think this is something that we could do here? So a small group of us, it was really 3 or 4 of us. It was Dorothy Dunn, who lives here in Buxton, Ainsley Straminsky, who lives in Frisco, Melissa Fulcher, who lived on Ocracoke. There were a lot of other women who were very involved in those beginning days. But we pulled together this auxiliary to the North Carolina Fisheries Association, which was a statewide trade organization for fishermen. And we did a pretty good job. The auxiliary worked really, really well for about 10 years. And then it kind of fizzled out, I think. Burnout, we all got tired. There weren't any younger women coming in because there weren't a whole lot of younger men entering the industry.
What kind of things did you do as a women's group? Was it fundraising, or?
We did a little bit of that, and I think the fellow who is the executive director of the Fisheries Association was hoping we would focus on fundraising, making, having bake sales and benefit dinners to make money for the organization. But some of us really were real interested in learning about the issues and advocating solutions for some of those problems. So in the early days of our auxiliary, and I need to go back and say, there was an auxiliary in Carteret County, and there was one in Pamlico County, and there was interest in other areas of the coast in starting auxiliaries. So in the early days, we hear about some regulatory measure coming down the pike. We would write up position papers, why this would work, why this one wouldn't work, the impact on fishermen, and go to fisheries meetings and speak. Well, especially in the early years, we attracted a whole lot of attention because commercial fishing was sort of a man's domain, and it was men making the decisions and men speaking. So, of course, to have some women walk in and speak attracted a lot of attention in the beginning. We did some fundraising. We did some neat things like, you've probably heard of beach sweep, cleaning up the beach, but we did it on the Sound, organized where people would clean up debris on the Sound side. Some of the boats would go out and collect debris from the water. Partnerships with the school, a lot of public relations type. But we had monthly meetings, sometimes, sparsely attended. Other times, if there was an issue on everybody's radar screen, a lot of folks attended. We'd have guest speakers come talk about different issues. We had people who were in the regulatory agencies come meet with us. Our elected officials come meet with us. And even though the organization, the auxiliary, was run by women, and our officers were all women, it really was a organization for the fishermen too. I mean, they attended, and people outside in the industry attended also. So, I think we were effective on some levels, but we were also pretty naive about how decisions are made, and that sometimes that's a lot more complicated than what you think. And so we were pretty naive on some fronts.
Well, was there one thing that it finally clicked in your mind that you needed to be more actively involved in understanding the regulations? I mean, was there one thing that you decided you need to do more than having the bake sales and the beach cleanup, that you needed to take a more
there was
role
yes
in your activism?
Yeah, and actually the first thing that we witnessed that made us understand that was a regulation that wasn't even going to impact fishermen on Hatteras Island or Ocracoke. It had to do with shrimp trawling. But we looked at what was happening to that sector of the industry and realized, you need to keep on top of things. There were other cases in those early years. All of a sudden, a lot of anti-commercial fishing rhetoric was starting to come out of Raleigh and some inland areas. And that certainly spurred our interest in being as proactive as possible. Once again, we were sort of naive and thought, well, you just tell the truth and, things will work out. There were several issues, and one to do with catching gray trout that at that point would have had a huge impact on fishermen on Hatteras Island. So that was one of the key issues that we worked on. Then when we started off, the presidents of auxiliaries were voting board members of the North Carolina Fisheries Association. And it wasn't with our group, but with another auxiliary. The president had taken a stand on something that the parent organization wasn't too keen on. At that point, the executive director sort of disenfranchised all the auxiliaries, so we no longer had a vote on them as board members, which I think that sort of sucked out a lot of enthusiasm. We felt like we needed to have that vote to have full representation. And certainly none of us wanted to have bake sales for an organization where we didn't have critical input in decisions and deciding policy. So, but that was kind of funny how that played out. Like, okay, you no longer can vote on the board. But it was, looking back, it was really exciting times. It was, for me personally, I really liked that atmosphere. Women, researching issues and developing responses, going to meetings and presenting information. I grew up in a very political family. And it's kind of funny because one of the reasons why I think I liked Hatteras so much when I first came here was because it was removed from Washington, and you weren't listening to the news every night and that sort of stuff. So it's sort of strange that I kind of came back around to being involved politically.
But thank goodness for your background, because I think they needed someone like you to present a voice. And at what time in all this did you decide to co-author the book with Barbara Garrity-Blake, the Fish House Opera?
Let's see. Barbara was involved in the auxiliary in Carteret County, where she lives. And we were appointed to a committee that had a funny name. It was the North Carolina Fisheries Moratorium Steering Committee, established, this was probably about 1994, I think. And the moratorium, there was a moratorium on the sale of commercial fishing licenses, and this committee was going to study how licenses were structured and really study the whole realm of fisheries management in North Carolina and develop a report with recommendations, which we did, and some of those recommendations were actually implemented, became law. Barbara and I think there were about 20-some people in the committee, and Barbara and I were the only two women who were there at every meeting. So at lunchtime, we usually ate lunch together. After that committee's work was finished, the way I remember it was Barbara and I, she was teaching at East Carolina. I was still busy with fisheries issues, but we hadn't really talked in several months. And all of a sudden one day the phone rang. It was Barbara, and she was like, "Susan, I heard something on the radio this morning. Do you want to write a book about fishing villages in North Carolina?" I was like, "Sure, yeah." Yeah, why not? So we decided we could do this because our writing styles are a little similar. So we started writing without a real plan or strong structure. And this Fish House Opera was published in 2003. So when we started writing this was about 5 years earlier. I didn't have a computer then. So, I would write something, and then I would mail it to Barbara. Then she would rework it and mail it back to me. So it was quite the process. But we were able to work on it together we're still good friends, and we still like each other. A lot of people say, "How could you write a book with somebody else?" And we worked out a system. It was sort of like, I would write something, I would send it to Barbara. If she took out something I felt strongly about, I'd reinsert it, and that was the message, this is important to Susan. And there were a lot of benefits to working together also, because she brought her knowledge and I brought my knowledge, and because fisheries are not the same along the coast of North Carolina that was good because we had different knowledge of different issues that we could bring together. It was also very helpful after we got a manuscript that we thought we could present to publishers, and that took a long time. In fact, we had a much longer book that we wrote, and we both came to a conclusion, pretty much at the same time. It's like, okay, we've got this long book, but who's going to read it? It's just going to be people who already know the story, the fishermen and their families. And we weren't writing for them. We were trying to write something for somebody who maybe didn't know too much about commercial fishing. So when we went to find a publisher, that's when it was really good to have two people involved, because it's hard to find a publisher. It can be very discouraging. And I would get really annoyed and aggravated and ready to throw the manuscript in the back of the closet. And it would seem like then Barbara would be upbeat and like forge on, we'll find, don't worry, send out letters to more publishers, or vice versa. And it was Mystic Seaport in Connecticut published it. But it was kind of strange. We had sent them a letter, and we never heard anything. And meanwhile, we were getting rejection letters from other presses. Some of them are asking us to, this is kind of interesting, but, bring in more voices of recreational fishermen, or bring in more voices of regulators. And we considered doing that, but that wasn't our intent or our interest from the beginning. Our interest was to give voice to the commercial fishermen whose point of view usually was not presented in newspaper articles or academic journals. So I remember one day, I'm just looking at rejection letters, and I called an author who's written a woman in Alaska who's written some books about fishing. And she was like, well, how many rejection letters do you have? I said, I think there's 15. She was like, you cannot even begin to feel discouraged until you have 100. So then I was like, okay, thank you. So that became my goal. It was like, okay, let's see if we can get 100 rejection letters so our discouragement would be validated. But we went months and months and never heard anything from Mystic Seaport. And so finally we got back in touch with them. And this is a bizarre story, but our letter, their director of publications, the person we addressed the letter to, had passed away. And our letter was in his desk. And when we sent a follow-up letter, they had just hired somebody to take his position. And this young man was very interested in publishing Fish House Opera. And we had a very good relationship with Mystic Seaport and with our editor there. He was a fantastic person. So that's how that came to be.
Well, 10 years later, are you still involved with being a voice with the commercial fishermen regulation process, or have you moved on to different areas?
At this point in time, I'm not exactly focused on specific regulations. I'm still focused on general policy. In other words, my attention really isn't directed at something like a particular closed fishing season or a gear restriction. But my attention is on sort of broader issues, like who will be able to fish in the future. Are we implementing regulations and policies that help us get to that point where we want to get in the future? Have we considered that it's very difficult for young people to get into the industry now? I mean, when my husband got into the industry, he worked several years as a mate. And then we bought our first boat, was a shad boat for pound netting in the Sound. The boat cost a couple $1,000s, and that was the expense and the expensive gear of the net. Now, for some fisheries, we have permits that you have to buy that can cost, well, a sea scallop permit is several $1 million right now. So young people don't have the opportunities to start a small business, commercial fishing, the way my husband and that generation had. Are there things that we can do to help young people enter? Are there things, another thing I've been involved with recently is working to ensure that seafood is viewed as a local food. There's lots for farmers, local food, produce and all, but we also, right here, seafood is our local food, essentially. So moving seafood into the whole local foods movement, and I think that has been good. It's been strong. It helps for people to see seafood and commercial fishing, to remember, that's what fishermen do, essentially, is harvest the resource for consumers. Bring that seafood out of the water so it can get on tables. So since 2011, I've served on the board of a nonprofit called NC Catch that helps local catch groups like Outer Banks Catch promote local seafood and educate consumers that we do have local seafood here, but there's seasons to it. So a whole lot of consumer education needs to go on about availability of seafood. About 2 years ago, there were two gentlemen who, it was around Thanksgiving time, two gentlemen who were vacationing in Rodanthe with their families, and knew a woman that I also know, that we both independently had done some work with her, and she had asked me when they were here on the island if I would meet with them and take them to a fish house. So I met them and took them to Hatteras Village to a fish house. And they told me they had vacationed here something like 25 years, and they'd never seen a fish house, and they had no idea there were fish houses here. So thinking about that, well, how would people even know to ask for local seafood? Because our commercial fishing fleet is not very visible. So, your visitors here, you don't know that they're commercial fishermen. You go to the restaurant, you don't know enough to even ask for local seafood. So that's something that I've been involved with. Broader policy issues, more than specific regulatory details, which I think I just those have worn me out.
Well, the group that you're involved with now, the NC Catch, do they provide a way for the younger generation of commercial fishermen to provide scholarship money? I mean, how would a young commercial fisherman even have money to buy a boat now, much less the permitting that's required?
Yeah, that's something that hopefully NC Catch and other organizations will address in the future. There's some examples in other parts of the country of communities helping young people get into the fishing industry. Communities that don't want to lose their working waterfronts, don't want to lose the commercial fishing as both an economic activity but also as an important heritage component. So we need to look at some of those communities and learn more about what they're doing and see if we could do that in North Carolina.
Well, I know you're involved with Day of the Docks.
I am.
So I would just please tell me how you're involved, and I'm excited about it personally. So tell me how your involvement with Day of the Docks.
Day of the Docks started in 2005, and it originated after Hurricane Irene in 2003. No, Hurricane Isabel in 2003. And that was the one where the ocean breached Highway 12 and Hatteras Village was cut off. That was an interesting time because in Buxton and Avon and this part of the island, there was very little damage. So I'd go to work at the post office and it would seem like everything was hunky-dory, except you couldn't get to Hatteras Village. So our boat is docked in Hatteras Village. Our boat is the Lucy B. It was built here in Buxton in 1980, but docked in Hatteras Village. So my husband and some of the other fishermen with boats docked in Hatteras Village took a skiff to get over to Hatteras to get to the boat to work. But Hatteras Village had no economic activity during that time because visitors couldn't get there, except for commercial fishing, because they arranged for the fish trucks to leave. So one friend of mine down there said it reminded him of growing up in the 50s where it was mostly commercial fishermen. There wasn't much else going on. The following year, Hatteras had a blessing of the fleet. That was the first one that I was aware of, and that was great. And then from there, a couple of key people, Lynn Foster and her husband Ernie Foster, primarily decided to expand it into Day at the Docks, a full-day celebration of fishing. And I've been involved with it since then. It's gotten larger, more popular, but hasn't, I think, it still retains sort of a homey type feel to it. It's really nice. You see, local families reuniting there, but also there's visitors, there's tourists there too. So, it's nice, it's low key. The last couple of years with that, I've been involved with a seafood throwdown, which is helping to organize that, and that's sort of an Iron Chef competition. Where two chefs from two restaurants on the island compete, cooking using a seafood ingredient for their dish that they don't know of until the competition starts. And last year it was ribbon fish, which I think there was probably 150 people in the audience watching this, and I would bet, maybe 2 or 3 had ever tasted ribbon fish. So that was a challenge. But that's a fun event. It promotes our local restaurants and our local seafood in a fun, dynamic way, that people would enjoy. And I think, if anything, I've learned through the years that the public responds better to something like a seafood throwdown than to a white paper laying out all sorts of reasons about why buying local seafood is good.
Yeah. That's very smart.
Yeah.
That's a smart idea.
Yeah, it is.
So now you've moved on, or not moved on, but you've added to your plate the Coastal Voices project.
Yeah.
So you look like you partnered once again with Barbara Garrity-Blake.
Yeah.
And can you tell me what started that? Why did you decide to add this to your
Barbara
project?
and I had, Barbara was the lead on an oral history project back around 2002, and I conducted some oral histories for interviews for that project. The last couple of years, it's been Barbara and Karen Amsbacher, the director at Poor Sound Waterfowl Museum in Carteret County, working with the Park Service on obtaining funds for an oral history project. Those funds have been delayed again due to strange things that happen in Washington. The park hopes to have some funds available later this year, but after 2 years of delay, Barbara said, let's figure out some other way we can raise a little bit of money to at least get things started. If we can do something, we can get an online exhibit started, have a stash of oral histories, we should be able to find funding in the future, even if the Park Service doesn't come through with it. And I think I just said, we need to do something. We need to do something. It's important to collect these stories. So we did the video and set up the Kickstarter campaign, and something like 97 people supported the project. So they supported it with donations from $1 up to $1,000. I don't usually like to ask people for money to support, but I thought, well, $1, that's cool. It's not like I'm asking everybody for millions. So that, we've got it. It's starting up. I think it's going to be really great, and I can't wait to have a collection of oral histories that can be available to everybody. People who live here, people whose family members may have been interviewed, our visitors. I mean, we have such beautiful stories on this island.
And where will people be able to find the stories?
Well, we're not quite sure as to what our URL address will be, but there'll also be hopefully copies of all the oral histories at places like the Hatteras Library, the Outer Banks History Center. I mean, our whole goal is to make these as available to as many people as possible. Not, to have everybody own them, because they're community stories that should be owned by everybody. They're certainly not owned by me or Barbara, or by the library or the history center. Make them available. The clips that people can take from these oral histories that would complement displays in some of our local museums. I think that would be fantastic. I like printed words and all, but there's really something about hearing somebody's voice tell a story that I think, especially for museums and all, it brings it to life more. So,
well, I have one last question for you.
Yes,
because I know I'm wearing you out. What keeps you here?
Good question. I've lived here a long time. I've seen a lot of changes, and to be honest, there are a lot of things that I'm not keen about, but every place changes. You have to get used to it. But sometimes I'll have days where I wonder, and I know exactly what it is. Then I'll stop in Connor's supermarket to get my groceries, and other customers in there and the people that work there know me, and might call me by my name. I think, gee, if I lived in suburbia, that wouldn't happen, So I like that. I like that we are a community, and we do know each other, and we do know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we know when people need help too, which, is, I think we're a very kind and caring community.
Well, I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for doing the interview. I guess that concludes the interview, unless there's something you want to add.
I don't
want to wear you
any
out,
words of wisdom to share.
Yeah.
I think I've pretty much covered, my story.
You did. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sandy.
All right.
Sorry about my squeaky voice there.
All right.